All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to be here, and thanks for the opportunity to actually share my experiences based off on the topic that we're about to talk about. But first of all, let me just give a brief. She has already introduced myself, and I would just like to give just a bit of context as to my place in design. I've been in the design space for, let's say, the last 15 years, thereabout, and I've actually transitioned in different scenarios and different hats, in the sense that I've been in the advertising space, and I've been in the product development space, and I've also been in different spaces. But in all these spaces, one of the beautiful things that I've learned is that it pays to actually create something that solves a problem, right? That's the reason why we're all here, because at the end of the day, whatever you're creating or developing, how do people feel about what you've actually done? And how do people feel about what you're creating? And that's the whole essence of why we're here. So let's start with this, right? First of all, how many designers do we have here? Okay, 2. How many QAs do we have here? How many engineers do we have here? Fantastic. So we have engineers here. Fantastic. I used to write Java once in my life. At a point in my life, I used to write Java. Let's go, please. No, next slide. All right, so what are we going to learn here today? Fine. 4 things, right? We're going to understand why API UX matter more, in the sense that we have lots of APIs, right, that have been deployed, and the experiences with those sort of APIs are not really great, right? So we're going to explain why UX actually matters with APIs. Secondly, we need to also understand that API as a concept, it should be a product and should not be treated as just anything that should be functional, right? We should treat it as a product on its own. And when we start to do that, then we start to think about UX. What makes seamless API experience? And then obviously we'll take a little bit of scenarios in terms of case studies. All right. So this is my concept or conceptualization about APIs, right? People actually don't see APIs, and that's the truth. So whatever you've actually developed, thank God we have developers here. Whatever you're actually developing or whatever you've developed, at the end of the day, the functionality is what a lot of people see. People don't see the work that you've done. People don't see the line of codes that you've actually, written. But at the end of the day, what people see is actually the output, and which is the functional side of things. But the most important thing is not the functionality. The most important thing is how did they feel about how they used the product, right? So yes, definitely they would actually feel their impact some sort. And that's why I actually stated that API are actually invisible layers that powers great experiences. I'm going to give a very simple illustration. So most times when you want to make payments on some platforms, obviously you would see choices like Paystack, Flutterwave, and stuff like that, right? And my favorite for me is actually Paystack, and that's because of how I feel about how I use it. But the point is that it actually boils down to all the products that we're actually working on and whatever we're actually developing from an API perspective. The thing is this, that when you want another software to communicate with another software, that's the whole essence of APIs, you would need to understand the fact that whenever parameters are being passed or whatever you're actually going to decide what the endpoints are, right, you need to clarify how will a user actually experience this if they have to impute this to get this. What would be that workflow process? How would they feel about that process from point A to point Z? And that's the whole essence of why we're actually here today. So next slide. Now, why would an API UX matter more? First, the rise of digital ecosystems. Today we see a lot of situations whereby we have e-commerce, we have Web3 platforms. There are so many ecosystems right now that demand APIs, right? For example, I'm going to use the company I work for, Seamless HR, as an example. What we do is that we change the narrative when it comes to productivity of the workforce. And what we do is that we're trying to actually sell HR from end to end, from onboarding to the exit of an employee. And in that dimension, right, how would a user experience your product? There are scenarios whereby you have to tackle payroll. There are scenarios whereby you have to tackle performances. There are some scenarios whereby you have to tackle leave and stuff like that. Now, in a scenario whereby I work in a company, you work in company A and she works in company B, and you're only interested in payroll, and she's only interested in leave, and you have another software that actually solves the issue of leave, right? Or performance. Now, how do you correlate, or how do you tie? A lot of companies tie payroll to performance. Some companies tie payroll to attendance. You agree with me, right? Yeah, so how do you marry that, especially if the softwares they're actually using are from two different vendors? Now, that's where API comes into play. How do you make that process very seamless? Now, some vendors or some softwares would have actually thought about it to understand the fact that, okay, we know that we cannot, not every company will choose us for some certain scenarios. So let's try to create a seamless API that would plug in or communicate with other cadences or other softwares that you already have. And that's how to think, right? Even though that's a good innovation, however, how you go about it is now how you have to elevate the user experience in that regard. So, rise of digital ecosystems. 2, API powers experience across products. We just talked about that. The last thing is design is no longer UI only, and that's good. Because, again, there are some scenarios whereby you actually, when you're designing APIs, so there are scenarios whereby parameters are only what is expected. And there are scenarios whereby we still need to, some users need to interface with a front end or a UI, right, as an API to actually perform some certain interactions or perform an action. So it's no longer about UI, it's no longer about functionality, it's now about how I feel about what you've done. So the next thing, please. Now, so this is where we've really gone wrong. I'm actually going to state this as a problem, right? First of all, we tend to see scenarios whereby we have poor UX across our API models, and that's the truth. To be honest with you, I remember when I started to design, I realized that a lot of designers, when you just hear the word API, they just say, oh, just leave it for developers, just leave it for developers. And that's not how it's supposed to be, right? Even though you're working as a team, a lot of people just feel that API is so technical, right? That's the meat. Well, let's call it, that's the whole approach. But it's more than that right now with the way things are actually evolving. We need to make whatever we are designing in form of API, we need to make it more experiential, right? The second thing is lack of empathy for developers. I understand this. In fact, I work in an integrations team, right, as simple as HR. And one of the things that I realize is that most times, developers are actually doing stuff on their own. They take some solid decisions without trying to interface with, there is a technical expert, there is a designer, or obviously there's a PM, right? But there are some certain scenarios whereby there'll be a roadblock. And that's because you're trying to navigate, if I should make this sort of change, how would the user feel about it if they should make that action? So at that point, you need to actually interact or seek an opinion of either the PM or the designer or the product designer to understand, will this actually be feasible? Sometimes the actions that we take could actually increase task overload, and that doesn't make sense to any user. Why will I have to take 7 steps to actually perform an action, right? That doesn't make sense. So there are scenarios like that, and that's why we shouldn't leave everything to the developer, right? And that's why I'm thinking about empathy for developers, because most times in some scenarios, we tend to leave a lot of things to the developers to decide. The last thing, broken onboarding, unclear documentation. I cannot overemphasize this. I mean, it's a good thing to actually develop an API as a product, but if you do not develop documentation on how to use it, then that's a problem. I think documentation is a very, very serious thing. One of the things that we are doing right now, at Seamless HR, we are at the point or the phase whereby we're actually documenting a lot of things, especially with the cadences in terms of new products, in terms of new ideas, in terms of new innovations like AI and stuff like that, integrations. How do you want developers to actually employ this? For example, if you're working in a system where you have a lot of modules, right, for a software, now, and those modules actually have different developers, right? Now, if developer A has solved the problem that could be taken around the other developers, right? That could be taken as a yardstick or as a document that's where we need a very clear documentation. For example, if I want to integrate AI, maybe in performance, and developer A in payroll has already integrated AI in some sort, I would need that sort of documentation to help me integrate AI in my order. And that's why documentation is very, very important, because there are some scenarios whereby you would actually create a solution that requires documentation for other developers to actually follow. Next thing. All right, so this is another thought process. Every API is a product, right? And not just developers. Not just developers are users, but designers too are users, right? You might be thinking that your documentation that you're creating, even as a designer, I go through documentations. I'm just telling you the truth. As a designer, I go through documentation. So designers too are your users. Businesses are your users. For example, maybe as a business, I want to integrate a particular payment model on my platform, right? There needs to be a proper documentation for that business to be able to understand how to integrate that in their own product. Businesses should not be obliviated from this. PMs, engineers, QAs, all this set of people are all users, especially when it comes to API. So we shouldn't treat API as just a solo performance kind of thing. It shouldn't be, because we have lots of users that are going to be interested in that product. So let's treat API UX, right, as user UX. Next thing. So what makes seamless API experience? What makes a seamless API experience? Number one, it should be discoverable. One, it should be discoverable. Two, it should be consistent. And when I say discoverable, it means that it should be easy to find. If you have a website where you actually have all this documentation stored, fantastic. You can actually use a website or somewhere. Consistency across boards, meaning that there should be consistency both from a branding perspective to the way codes are being written and stuff like that, and methods are being written. Predictable in the sense that if you have some sort of, the way error handling is being handled across board should be synonymous to everyone. I don't know the kind of softwares you're working on, but in an enterprise solution, you should ensure that there's a good versioning, there's a good structure that solves error handling, right? Secondly, it should be human-friendly, and that's where documentation comes into play. One more thing. Sorry, go back. So another beautiful thing that I learned, recently, I won't say recently, let's say 2-3 years back. One beautiful thing I really love about documentation is the fact that some developers or designers tend to also include the sandbox sort of thing, right? And that helps for people to interact with whatever the feature is before they even tend to, okay, let's even implement it, or let's use this feature for our model. So that's another good thing. I love playgrounds a lot. Next thing. All right, so I know that most of us are not developers, but again, please, if you're working in a team, which I feel you should work in a team, right? You can't do this on your own. So you need to also understand that your designer in your team has a role to play in whatever stuff you're doing, and they shouldn't be oblivious of that fact. So a designer's role and that would also help you guys, because I feel that as a PD, right, you need to bridge the gap between development and design thinking. I don't want to start going into design thinking, because design thinking is another process. And the reason why that is because the perspective of a PD helps you to understand that, okay, in whatever you've actually done, you've actually considered the user. You've considered all the spectrums of users that would be in play for that particular product. Secondly, you should advocate for DX. I can't overemphasize this because I know a lot of developers, some actually complain, a lot complain, right? But I think that we should start to look at the developer's angle, right? Especially when it comes to API documentation. And the other stuff is use cases from UX side. That's from a designer standpoint, you need to understand that whenever you're working on a product, you need to understand what are the other use cases in which whatever you're developing can be used, right? Look at the entire spectrum from endpoints, both endpoints, and see what are the feasibilities, the possibilities, how flexible can it be, what's the ease of use, and all that. Next thing. All right, from UX to DX. So, user experience to developer experience. Pretty much, I don't know, how many of us have heard of developers portals? How many of us use developers portals? Oh, fantastic. Okay, just one. Anyone else? Developers portal. Okay, so that's fine. All right, so one beautiful thing about developers portal, you use developers portal. All right, so for developers portals, obviously, and it depends on what the product is, and it depends on what service you're offering, whether it's to your end users externally or to your users internally, right? I feel like developers portal actually opened my eyes to understand the possibilities that can really happen, and how how can you even shorten the process for users outside, right? Instead of them having to call or seek support as to how can I solve A, B, C, or D. I mean, with the help of Developers Portal, you can actually extend the possibilities to even your clients outside, right? And I mean, client management, API keys. I mean, you can think of so many things, even modules or product management and stuff like that. You can think about the entire spectrum of your product, and that's something that Developers Portals can really, really do. I already talked about live playgrounds, code samples, and instant feedback. I mean, this is something that we should always think about. So whenever a PD is actually involved with anything API, they should also think about developers' experience. That's what I'm trying to say. So aside thinking about user experience, they should also think about developers' experience, because at the end of the day, when it comes to API documentations and all, most times developers are the ones that are at the forefront, right? Next. All right, so this is a very simple way of explaining how you can actually interact with your designer, right? And I think that whenever you are given a brief or you have an API brief, right, I think, and it involves design, right, I think these are the 4 processes that you need to have, especially when you have a designer in your team. So first of all, you need to understand the use case. At what point, whatever API you're trying to develop, at what point is it going to be used? What are the use cases? I mean, explore all that, look at the entire scenario and checkmate it, right? Second thing is to understand that after you've been able to discuss the use cases, then you should be able to map the endpoints, right? At what point, what are the endpoints in terms of the methods, get or post methods, right? What's going to be involved in that entire scenario? And then the next thing would be for the designer to now prototype, come up with a beautiful design, prototype it, and then voila, you can now validate the design structure and then for shipping. Okay, so I think I'm just going to end here. If you want your API to be loved, please make it human. And I can't overemphasize this because I've interacted with so many APIs that feels very boring. Yes, it's very functional. Most APIs could be very functional, and there are sometimes that will return errors. But I think that we should relook how we design APIs. We should think about how users will feel about it. It's not a bad thing to actually reevaluate and innovate with our APIs, right? You can do so many fantastic things with APIs. And so I'm saying that if you really want to do something great with your APIs, let's make it human, right? Think about the users. Don't just think about developers or the technical standpoint. Think about the empathy standpoint. All right. So next slide. Yeah, thank you very much.